Um, I figured the best way to do talks for myself anyway, years ago, was to split it up and into sections of like a 5 minute or 2 minute slideshow with music and then a 10-minute talk. And I'll admit that it was a complete cop-out because it helps me get over my nerves. But it also just allows everybody to get a bit of an introduction to what I do, and you can get to see a bit of a sort of an overview of the portfolio. So that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to give you hopefully 3 slideshows today and 3 different subjects I'm going to talk about. So anybody that does know what I photograph, I'm basically going to do a quick introduction here with an overview of images that I've shot over the last 5 or 6 years. And then after that, I'm going to go straight into Bolivia, the sort of Altiplano. It's a real minimalism kind of area for me. Then on to Harris, and I'm going to explain why I've gone from Bolivia to Harris, because I think they're very highly related. And then I'm going to finish with Hokkaido in Japan. So I'm now going to cop out here and give you a 3-minute slideshow with some music. Bit of a long fade out on that piece of music there. So years ago, when I had to try and explain my photography to other people, it's a really good time to actually go back and actually look at what you do and actually try and figure out who you are. And I found that running workshops for the last 8 years has really helped me try and figure out exactly what I'm doing with my photography, and it's actually not just helped me become a better teacher, but also try and understand myself a bit better. And I think if I had to sort of sum it down, it would be, I'm really into sort of very abstract shapes and patterns, and I'm really into trying to look for a graphic element in the landscape. So this is a really recent picture for me. This is actually in the Fjatlabak region of Central Highlands of Iceland from this September. And I was there with a group, and we ended up talking about this line. Now, some of you might actually think that that's ice there, and with a melting pool in the middle, it's actually the opposite way around. The white bit is actually the water, and the black bit in the foreground is actually a sandbar. The deserts are really black in the middle of the Central Highlands. For me, it's almost got like a bird-like shape to it. And with the group, we spent a lot of time debating the very, very corner on the far left-hand side, almost of the beak of the bird, about where to cut it, because that whole pattern just kept going on into the landscape. And I think it's often a case of it's more a case about what you leave out than what you put in the shot, really. Certainly my style is down to a very simplified, I'm trying to really, really reduce it down if I can, and even down to, it's not just from subject matter, it's also in terms of tone. I'm also extremely lucky that I get to go to some really fabulous places, and it never escapes me every time I go back to Torres del Paine in Patagonia. It's one of my favourite places. I've been going there since 2003, and a bit like some of the other speakers today, they were saying that when you spend a lot of time in a landscape, it almost becomes richer, the experience. You're able to explore it at a more deeper level. And I love this little curved beach. It's actually on a little island, and I should have actually included a photograph to show you the hotel that's just out of the shot. It's on the left-hand side. I've got some of my high school friends, when they started seeing that I was doing these things, they were saying to me, "Oh, I'd love to go where you go, Bruce, all these wilderness places." And I'd point out and say, well, there was actually a gift shop to the right of the shot that I took. So again, I think it's about what you leave out. But that curved beach, just to give you an idea of it, it's maybe about somewhere like about 5 to 10 feet long. It's not very big. So I find that it's really about I can sometimes find that I'll work in maybe just a metre of foreground, and I'll be quite happy. I'll sit there for an hour or two, and I'll find tons of little variances in the composition. And I love it when I go there with groups, because they're always surprised. They always say to me, "Really, it's tiny? It's absolutely tiny." And I'm saying, well, I don't think you need an awful lot of landscape. It's really about finding, well, for me anyway, it's really about finding that graphical element in the landscape. And it's not just simply because it's a curve, it's also because I think it sort of balances with the headland that's diagonally opposite it as well. And you could almost argue that the headland on the far right-hand side of the frame is not needed, but when you add other darker tones into the picture, what you do is you take the energy away from that headland at the back. I think if the beach wasn't as dark as it was, that headland at the back would be far too dominant. And sometimes I see patterns between objects, and I would never normally place an object or two objects so close together to each other, but something that was also discussed today is that you just tend to go with a gut instinct. It's more like a feeling, and you can't really quite consciously understand why you're doing it at the time. All you know is it feels right. One of the things I like to talk to people on composition is, well, if you put like a mountain right above a tree, your eye will tend to hunt backwards and forwards between the two of them. And then I had somebody on a trip with me, and he said to me, well, how does this picture work? Because that doesn't work the way you're telling me. So I figured a get-out clause for this one. I actually decided that because the tree and the mountain in the background are quite tightly related, they are essentially, in my mind, one object. And I think it's just basically because that tree just fits into the shadow of the mountain there. I'll tell you where this is. It's actually in Ullapool. It's actually it's not Stack Poly. It's actually, I think it's Ben Eon on the other side of the loch there. A lot of people make the mistake, they think it's Stack Poly. And it was a complete surprise. I think that most of the time with photography, it's very much about being open-minded and trying to not pre-visualize too much. And when I talk about pre-visualizing, I'm talking about you don't go there with an agenda. You just turn up and you just see what happens, and you try and respond very much to what's been presented to you. And initially I saw the tree and I thought, that's very interesting, let's go down. And it was only when I was setting up that last minute I just realized, hang on, that fits into the relationship or the shadow of the mountain there. So then I spent it must have been 15 minutes of frustration trying to get this tripod set up on a 45-degree slope with very, very clumpy material around. But again, it's just that I'm sort of looking for relationships, not just in terms of subject matter, but in terms of patterns and tones, very much so. And to me, I think this is probably, it sums up exactly what I'm looking for. We all know this place now. It's become phenomenally famous now and phenomenally popular. You can almost not go there now and not have that place to yourself. I'm good friends with Daniel Bergman in Iceland, and he tells me sometimes now, I've not been here now for 2 years, and he tells me that you can have up to 150 photographers there in the morning, all lined up on the beach taking pictures. But when you are there, sometimes you do see seals in the Atlantic there and in the lagoon. And I was just walking along looking for different subjects, and I just felt this was a nice seal. And I just love those sort of connections sometimes if you can find them. It's not that I intentionally go out to look for them, it's just about recognizing them when you stumble upon them. And I made several pictures of this one, but the long shutter speed really worked, because when I had a really short shutter speed on it, it just broke a line. The wave line going right through it was just too much of a distraction, and it felt like two separate pictures. And by doing a very long deliberate exposure on that, I was able to make that sort of tonal shift, a very soft tonal shift through to the background. So the next place I would like to talk about is the Altiplano. And it's turned into a bit of a real muse for me, if you like. I have this theory now that certain landscapes, when you meet them in your life, they take you in new directions, and a bit like, meeting a certain person in your life at the right time, can all of a sudden your whole life can just go in a new direction. I think that's the same very much with landscapes. Sometimes if we go to some landscapes, we're just not ready for them. We can't work with them. They're either too complex, or maybe they're too simple. And it's all about trying to find something that kind of resonates with you. And if you do find that kind of landscape, I would just tell you, just keep going back, because it just you tend to grow with it. And I think the Bolivian Altiplano in particular has been responsible for this simplification that I'm doing. So I'm just going to talk about that after another little slideshow. So I'm going to break it up again with some more music. So, one thing I'm really big on is I like to look back a lot because I get an idea of if I'm changing. And not that it's necessarily important if I did change or not, but it's just very interesting to notice because most of the time you feel it. And when I first went there in 2009, it was a real chance encounter. I was actually pushed there by a friend of mine who's got a South American travel company. And I was unemployed at the time. I'd just been sort of made redundant in 2008 from my IT job, which most of my friends that worked with me said that I hadn't been working there for years anyway. Because usually, every time my boss came anywhere near me, he always seemed to find me sort of updating my website. And I said to one of my colleagues, how come he always comes across when I'm updating my website? And he said, that's because you're always doing it. So I got made redundant in 2008 with the rest of my team. It wasn't just me. It wasn't down to my ability. And I remember my friend Kathy we got 4 people coming to Patagonia with me. And she said, do you want to do it? I said, yeah, let's do it. Let's just do it. It'll be good fun. And I had a great time with them. And she said to me afterwards, what are you doing after this? And I said, I've got nothing to do. And she said, well, I've just changed your flights. You're now going to Bolivia. And you're going to spend some time with my friend, Julia, she's a Bolivian girl. She's about 4.5 feet high. And she's going to take you around the Altiplano because Kathy was convinced that I should really go and explore it. So these are my first pictures there. And I would say that I always feel that you need to visit a place at the very least twice. The first time just to try and figure out what it is you need to photograph, and the second time hopefully to go back and photograph what you saw. And that never happens because then when you go back again, you actually find it's changed its face a little bit more, and you're seeing something different. But you're a bit overwhelmed in the first time. You don't understand the logistics, how far everything is, and there were lots of places I went to here where the light wasn't right, whatever. So these were just scratching the surface. But having said all that, I still felt that these were very, very much like, in my view, sort of more traditional landscape photography. And when I'm just going to show you, I'm going to go over the next 2-3 slides and just show you how there's been a progression since 2009. So I will point out a couple of things first before we move on, just to so you can pay attention to this. But first of all, the tones, I'm very big into big, strong colours here. But there's more distractions. Like this is all quite cluttered down here. On the beach, on this top right-hand corner picture, I find that's quite a bit too messy for me now. I'm not also very big on strong horizontal lines personally. I seem to have a problem with that. I do think I'm slightly compulsive obsessive. I find myself counting my footsteps when I'm walking along. And every time I see street signs, I'm always counting the letters in it, and it's really important to me that they add up to an even number. I don't understand it, it's strange, but anyway. So this is 2009, and I would like to point out that I think John was saying that he found that over the progress of his photography, it's not like he's intentionally decided, I want to do this and I'm going there. And I don't subscribe to this idea that we should strive anyway. It's more about going with the flow. So all I know is I'm on a journey and it's just going somewhere, and it's nice and it's comforting to know that I am evolving, if you like. So that's 2009, and that's 2012, and apart from the fact that I've gone to Square now, which I think is much more of a graphic aspect ratio anyway, you can almost plonk a square on anything sometimes and it looks interesting. Have you ever seen those websites where somebody's got these really interesting little square thumbnails? And you go, oh, that looks interesting. You click on it, and then you get this, it opens up and you see more of the picture. I actually sometimes find the little thumbnails are more interesting than the full picture is that you get to see. I actually feel these are almost like heading towards like these little color charts you get from Dulux, yeah? If you go into your DIY store. But it's not just that the compositions are getting simpler or they're getting more minimalist, it's also that I think I'm sort of working with the tones a bit more. And I think my awareness was improving with this one. And then this is 2015, and I just think it's like a further refinement. The tones are getting even smoother on it, and I think that I'm just learning all the time. I'm sort of, for the first part of my photography, it's all really been about what to put in the frame and what to leave out. And I think now I'm actually thinking more about, well, there's an extra dimension to this. It's also about the tones in the picture too. And even when you look at the two bottom right-hand pictures, they're very much about, it's just colour. It's just colour and tone. That's all that's in it, really. And I'll just tell you what they are. It's the salt flat. If anybody doesn't know about this, it's the Salar de Uyuni is the largest salt flat in the world, and it's at 3,600 metre elevation. So I'll go back very quickly on that, but you can see I think these look quite rudimentary in some respects to that, and then to that. It just seems like it's evolving, or the style's changing. So I would suggest that there was a talk earlier on, I think Tim was talking about finding your style, and I very much agree with him about you've got to gravitate to what you like. That's really it. That's what it is. But a sense of inquiry is very good as well. It's like I'm always asking myself questions, but not in a doubtful way. I tend to be always kind of thinking, is this better, is this worse? And I like to edit my images with a sense of distance. I never come home and edit them straight away. I like to leave them for months, and I've currently got like a back pile of about 3 years worth of film transparencies lying on a table. And the downside about that is that could become an emotional pressure that you feel like you've got like got this dead weight sitting on top of you, so you do have to clear it. But I do like giving things a bit of distance, usually a month or two before I get around to edit it. Anyway, so this is from 2009, and for me this really summed up where I thought I really wanted to go, if you like. And it was that strong diagonal in the sky. Every time that I run a workshop, I always put this up and ask people, what do you think the subject is in that picture? And some people tell me it's about the salt in the foreground, and some people tell me it's really about the sky. And I don't think there's any right or wrong answer to it, really. I'm kind of quite undecided about it myself, but there's a couple of patterns in here. First of all, it's almost like an ellipse in the sky. And I think subliminally, I'm convinced that we all, as photographers, we're responding to things very subliminally and subconsciously. And sometimes when I look back at images, I've discovered that there's some sort of balance going on in there that I wasn't even consciously aware of at the time. But ultimately, it really was about that diagonal. The difficulty I had was when I got there, I was on this little island in the middle of the salt flat, and I said to my guide, well, it doesn't matter where I walk, it's all the same. Because these little cones and everything, some of them are about, if you were driving at 60 kilometres, they're about 30 kilometres away. The salt flat's easily a couple of 100 kilometres in size. So I started to think about, well, what can I use to try and make the pictures more interesting? So then I started realising that sometimes patterns in the sky can be great motifs in their own right. It's also quite monochromatic, this picture. It's a study in blue, if you like. And these cones in the foreground, the black cones, with the lighter blues in the back. And I'm also quite happy to tell everybody that I'm really big on the sort of digital darkroom. I like to look at it very much in the way that Ansel Adams did with the dodging and burning techniques, so there was a lot of work done to that image. Interestingly, this one has actually had very little done to it, because I got into the car and I said to everybody, did you see that sort of HDR freaky sky that's out there? And I thought, every time that I show this, I'm sure people are going to think I've done something to the sky, but I really haven't. It was just, this is the Desert Siloli in the Bolivian Altiplano, and it's at 4,000 metre elevation. And I'd never been there when there's snow. It's the dry season I go with groups, because it's just the safest thing to do. And for some reason, the weather patterns 3 years ago were really messed up. So what happened was we got there and it was snowing, because if it rains at that high elevation, it's just going to freeze. We were literally there for 5 minutes. I walked around the corner, took this very quickly, and my guide called me back, got in the car. But I knew at the time that that was probably my favourite shot out of the whole trip. And I think sometimes that. We don't trust ourselves enough. I think we go there and we think, well, maybe it'll be better when we get home. And I think I was talking to Charlie Kramer yesterday, and he said to me that if his adrenaline isn't pumping when he's taking the picture, then it's kind of not worth taking. And I kind of agree with that. You feel it, you get excited. I usually find that I just, health and safety goes out the window sometimes. It's you just start getting really carried away with what you want to do. And of course, you can use sandbars and things like that as foreground patterns and things, which I'm very big on teaching everybody, and I just use that as sort of guidelines. This is Laguna Colorada, and it's a lake at 4,000 meters elevation that it's got a very red color to it often. But last year, we got there, and there was lots of golds and oranges in there. It was absolutely beautiful. This year when we went, it was almost dry, and they're actually saying that they might think it's going to dry up in the future. But it's the red colour is created by, there's an algae in the water there. But the previous slide where we had the snow, that was taken in the same time, and I never take pictures of wildlife, so that was a real change for me just to do this. And I've had people telling me it's flamingos in heaven, which is kind of a nice idea. But again, it's just working with subtle tones and things. But I do seem to be a little bit anal about trying to make sure I've got space around objects. Space seems to be phenomenally important to me in what I do. So that's Bolivia for you. Now, what I would like to say about this is that I'm convinced that if I'd not been to Bolivia, I don't think that my compositions and all the other work that I've been doing would have gone down that simplification path. I think it was like the catalyst for that. And that's why I think that going to certain landscapes when you're ready for them, or ready to receive them, if you like, is really important to your own development. And I really like the fact that I've been repeating certain places for years now. I keep going back, and I think the experience gets richer. But they kind of resonate with me in a way. They're places either because I like snow, or I like cold places for some reason. I seem to like very empty places. But when I went to Harris, the Isle of Harris years ago, I went back in 2009. 2007 or 2008 was the first time I went there. I just couldn't get it. I thought it was really photogenic, but I just couldn't find something in it. And I'm just going to show you after this. I'm going to do another little slideshow with music, and then I'm going to explain to you about how I think Harris is the Bolivian Altiplano.
I see you're soaking up praise while we're gasping for rain. Run indoors now, lest you shoulder the blame. Savior Walter, kill the roses. Savior precious Walter, kill the roses. A summer drought, it's all your own spell. Don't waste your water, kill the roses. Arriving late in church, your dress is sold. Don't you look miserable? Pinned to the dress, oh look, a dry white rose. You should be proud. A summer drought, it's all your own spell.
Sometimes the music just fades out. I'm not sure if it's got another segment to go yet. So I thought it'd be fun to maybe even show you a collection of images. Well, compare my 2009 images from the ones you just saw, because I see a sort of development there too. So that's 2009, and this is 2014 when I went back. And I'm convinced that I needed to go away for a while, back off from it, and go and sort my head out. And going to Bolivia for the last 5 years, I almost go every year now. And even when I'm not running workshops, I still manage to get myself there. I think last year I managed to go about 3 times in the winter time as well. So I didn't have Christmas. I was on the plane on Christmas Day going back. I kind of feel that in some ways. I think Bolivia just taught me so much. And when I came back and went to Harris again in 2014, I got it. That's how I feel about it anyway. I just felt that, yes, it's about atmosphere, it's about tones. You don't actually really have to have a lot of things in the picture. And I sometimes wonder that the reason why we're attaching ourselves to many things in a picture, it's almost like a security blanket. What's wrong with photographing almost nothing? There's, some ways it can be really, really abstract. This is the sort of Chilibost and Luskentyre area. It's a big, when the tide goes out during the day, you can actually walk right into this, and it's just a vast expanse of nothingness. And we had a lot of rain coming in that day, and I'm absolutely in love with rain because, I use Hasselblad cameras now. They're completely mechanical, so I don't have to worry too much about anything failing in rain or anything. But it's just because if I only shot in dry weather, it's so one-dimensional. There's only a real limiting aspect of what you could possibly do with your photographs. But I do have to kind of throw those Hasselblad cameras away every 3 years because there's a little guy down in London that I use to get them serviced now and again. And he phoned me up last time and he said, "The one you've sent me down, Bruce," he said, "Have you left it lying in a pool of water somewhere? Because it's all rusting inside." And I was like, ooh. I was thinking back about Norway and Iceland and Harris, and I said to him, I couldn't possibly think of any place where I could have done that, So I really don't care. These things are relatively kind of inexpensive now. But when I got there, this is the beach in Luskentyre and Chilibost, and I've got this client, Carlos, who's from the Bronx in New York, and he was standing right next to me, and he said to me, I thought it was brilliant, he said it to me before I said it, he said, "This could be Bolivia." And I said to him, absolutely. I just felt it was almost that Salar salt flat again. And it's almost like we've got this kind of comfort zone or muscle that we don't stretch enough. And once you start getting into really, really simple places and using them more and more, they actually get easier to try and find. And I'm very much the other way now. Rather than sort of trying to start off with too many things in the frame and reduce it down, I just tend to start off with 1 or 2 things and build it up from that. And again, it's about looking for patterns. This is the same beach, but the tides come in and it's very, very shallow, so we're getting this kind of sort of funky green light coming on in the foreground. And that's Northton at the very bottom part of Harris in the background there, coming through. And I was driving back with the group and saw it out the window, and everybody, I love it when you're running trips sometimes, because everybody's sometimes been really polite and they're all sitting there thinking, they're all thinking, I hope he's going to stop the van. And I said, I think we should stop the van. And you heard everybody going, oh, thank goodness for that, because that looks great. So we got out to photograph it. I do like dodging and burning things, and I like to sort of help bring on certain motifs or patterns in the picture. So there's a sort of diagonal in the sky at the top, and it's in the bottom too. So sometimes I like to balance sometimes the top of the frame with the bottom of the frame and help those motifs come out a bit more. The other thing that kind of Harris has taught me a wee bit is it's more about trying to look for sort of isolation, tonal isolation, and reduction in detail as well. When I edited this picture, I deliberately tried to remove as much textual detail of that sand foreground. And the interesting thing is, I think that's the reason why everybody likes that picture, if they do like it. And then the headland at the background that's super dark, that was actually punched in afterwards. I think one of the skills that we need as a photographer is it's not just to know when it's good light to photograph. It's more about how far we can push those boundaries, or where the boundaries are, the parameters of the tool set that we've got, how far you can pull and push things in Photoshop, for example, but how far you can work with the latitude of your film. Now, I'm totally 100% a film shooter. I just use Velvy all the time. And so I have a predisposition towards hunting for very, very soft light all the time. And I've got this friend up north, Adrian Hollister, who I believe does trips with Joe and David. And Adrian was telling me about Paul Wakefield came to visit him, and I would love to meet Paul. I think Paul's a fantastic photographer. And he said, you know what, Bruce, it's really interesting about Paul is that he's almost looking for no light in his pictures. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant, because that's how I look at it. And I think that's really interesting about photography. There's many different ways that you can skin the cat. But definitely for me, I'm looking for almost like really, really super flat tones. And then I can work in a creative way later on, deciding what I'm going to punch in or not into the picture. So with this particular picture, the sand has actually had a lot of tonal contrast removed on it. And I've actually deliberately added a lot of depth and contrast to that island in the top right-hand side of the picture. If that island hadn't been as dark as it is, I think the picture would just be too flat, too light. But I really like to try and play with certain objects and pull them out. David Ward was saying earlier on about people think very much more about objects and meaningful things when they're there, you know, like it's a tree or it's a river. And I'm very much with him on that it's more about we're looking for patterns and shapes. That's ultimately what a photograph is. When you break it down, it's tones, patterns, and shapes, and the emotional response you get from that. So Charlie said to me yesterday that I'm Michael Kenna in colour, which I personally find a huge compliment. And I was very lucky last year. I spent a week with Michael Kenna in Scotland, and it's kind of weird when you get somebody to get in touch with you that it's a bit like being a Rolling Stones fan and Keith Richards dropping you a line and saying, "Do you want to hang out next week?" So that was I didn't know how to read the email when I got it from him. I thought, is he looking for ideas? Shall I just suggest places, or does he want me to come along? So I went along with him for a week, and it was just an amazing experience for me personally to spend time with him. But one of the things that came out of it was he got me in touch with his guide in Hokkaido, so I got to go. And so I would like to show you these pictures. So again, I'm going to do another little slideshow with music, and then I'm going to talk about them. Well, personally, I think I've been on a wee bit of a journey. Over the last 7 or 8 years, the images have gotten simpler and simpler, and sometimes I feel that I'm almost just looking to photograph a white piece of paper. And in some ways, I really liked, there were certain things that John said earlier on about working in his, I believe that he worked in his kitchen, but he was saying his sitting room. And I know there's one picture of John's, but he's just photographed a sheet of paper flying. It was just about the tones. It's snow scenes. We're all addicts for it, really, aren't we? And but there's something quite magnetic about empty spaces, and I think it's because your brain just wants to fill in the gaps, and because it can't, we have to try and sort of imagine something that's there that isn't. And I think that's what makes them kind of mystical, if you like, or there's something very surprising about them, and so that's what I really loved about Hokkaido. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of the guide that I had. He makes you feel like a bit of a rock star when you're there because he's always photographing you. So I got in touch with him and he sent me some slides just to show you how I made some of these pictures. I thought it'd be quite useful to show you. The other thing I'd like to say as well is when you go to Hokkaido, it's extremely hard because everywhere you look, you just see Kena everywhere. And you think, oh, God, I can't shoot that either because... And I got to the point of saying to him, has Michael done this? And he said, no. I went, great, let's get the camera out. So this tree is actually really quite large. It's maybe about 2-3 times my height. So I've just written an article for Outdoor Photography, and I'm talking about how to... Steve Watkins asked me, how would you explain to somebody about simplifying down? And I've got this nice client of mine, Mike Allen. He's a Boeing 747 pilot for British Airways, but he said to me, it's funny, when I go into landscape booths, I have to spend all my time filtering it down. And I said, well, for me, usually I'm just there and I just see something off in the distance and I'm like a bee to it. I just make it straight a beeline for it. It's almost as if everything around it becomes invisible. So I'm going to ask you in the next slide, can you see the tree? Yeah. Can you see me? Yeah. So I'm going to come in now. You can see, that's me there. Oops, sorry, just what did I do? Hit a button? There we go, right. That's me there, trying to cross a river with about snow right up to my waist, while my guide's sitting in the car, probably having a good laugh to himself. But it's so interesting, he wasn't even going to point out the tree. He was going to try and point the tree out to me, but as soon as I stopped the car, I just saw it. I thought, oh, look at that. And I did initially think I was going to use this curve of on the right-hand side of the tree in there, that curve of those trees as well. But I got there and I just decided it's getting too complex. So I'm just going to go back to look at it now. And this projector doesn't really show you the line, but there actually is you can see a bit of line there, but it is a hill. There's a hill that goes up. I'm not sure where. It's somewhere like that. The hill goes along and then down and long. And just when I got there, I was setting the camera up, and it's such a weird experience to put a camera up and you're looking through it and you can see this tree, but it's like hovering in space because there's nothing else around it. I've never experienced quite that real degree of minimalism. And then just at that moment, the sun just broke through the clouds slightly, and I thought, I can't believe this. It's just the perfect timing. It's like it's on order, which is great. And I think it's all about just trying to work with what you're given at the time. I often get people saying, oh, I was a bit disappointed today. We went there and the landscape wasn't what I wanted it to be. And I think, well, the chances of you can put a cosmic order in the night before if you like, but it's not necessarily going to work for you. And I think, and the difficulty as well is when we've seen certain photographs of so many places, it's almost like it's difficult to see it another way. So anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting to show you. It's just so for me, I kind of almost filtered out all this clutter around there, and straight away I could just see that tree. I couldn't wait to get near it. The other thing about it is when you go to Hokkaido, you discover how phenomenally industrialized it is. It really is. There's noise, if you like, everywhere, and it takes a bit of work to try and filter that down. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the next shot. So this one here. I'm going to show you a shot of me on that landscape as well. I'm going to talk a couple of things about it. But first of all, I don't know on the projector if you can see it. There's like a little hill there. You can see it very faintly. And there's actually a very gentle shadow on the trees there. And I'm going to show you the location that I was in. It was quite simple. This is me. Yay! It's Bruce in the landscape. And it's not a very big tree at all, as you can see. But I felt it had this sort of Teletubby kind of landscape around it. So sometimes when you show people pictures, they're wondering how much work you've done to it. And in this instance, the work was really about a couple of things. I had a major dilemma because wherever I tried to set the shot up, I couldn't quite get rid of these background trees. And I just felt that no matter what I did, one of them was going to be in. So I settled for this one. And it's okay. I prefer if it wasn't there. But photography is the art of compromise. I think sometimes it's about understanding. It's great if you can see it at the time, and you know it's a problem. But you decide how far you can leave it in the shot, rather than come home and notice it later on. And I think there's a big disconnect. I personally have a real problem with the word post-process. I absolutely abhor it. I think it sort of encourages this idea that when you edit images, go home, that it's like an unrelated task. It's something that you do afterwards. I think there's a high relationship between them both. When I'm editing at home, it teaches me about tones, it teaches me about distractions, it teaches me about things that I should have seen when I was there. And I like to try and go back into the landscape, and I'm trying to look at the landscape less as landscape and more as a picture. So it's very difficult for us to try and abstract while we're there, and rather than thinking about the tree and the hill, is just to think about the tones or the textures or the balance or the symmetry in the picture. Another thing I was going to point out as well was you can see that the clouds, there's a lot of clouds here, and I did take quite a few. I was actually at this tree for about 2 hours taking pictures of it, and at some points the clouds would just, it got overcast, and I was much happier. That's even simpler. I just felt even those clouds were going to be too distracting, and I have a personal problem with blue skies. I need to go and get some help about it, I think, but I do have a problem with it. I can't stand them. So for me, it's more about just trying to help bring out this line in the landscape, which is very faint on the projector. It's actually a bit stronger if you actually saw it on my website, the shadow and just the tree. And I did do a bit of work on this. I tried to reduce as much contrast on that as I could when I got back. But I made the decision at the time when I was there. I said, right, it's got to stay in. No matter what I did, it was still there. Can I live with it? And sometimes some images you actually have to do nothing to get them. It's more about just recognizing the opportunity. And I was saying to Charlie yesterday that what I love about his work is that it took me years to realize that most of the time there's not a sky in his pictures. And I have a personal problem. I have to have skies in all my pictures. I can't do these kind of like intimate landscapes or these isolated places. But this one is exactly that. It's actually a whole snow hillside, and the next slide will show you me there. So that's me taking the picture of it. So it's pretty much verbatim. You know, I've maybe lit it up a bit more, made it brighter, but ultimately it was what was there. And it's about recognizing it. Initially I was just thinking about using this tree on its own, and where we were standing, I just saw the ferns and thought that would really work, really just super simple. And so when you go back to it, you know, it's about knowing your focal lengths. I'm not a big fan of zooms personally. I think zooms are for the experienced user. It sounds counterintuitive, but from my point of view, and bear in mind it is just everything you're hearing today from me is my point of view. It doesn't mean that it's right. My theory about zooms is that if you give yourself some primes, when you've got one lens to work with, you tend to sort of master it. You tend to understand not just the depth of field properties of it, but how it looks, how it renders. And also when you turn up at a landscape, say if you've got two lenses, you know exactly which lens to put on. And I think when you start off with zooms, you automatically think, if I get this zoom with all these different focal lengths in it, that's going to make it easy. But the problem is you're changing goalposts all the time. You're not just zooming in and out and changing the background. You're also changing the foreground at the same time. When you work with a prime, it's all about, if I put whatever focal length that was, I think it was 80mm or 50mm in my medium format camera, the background won't change much. If I move back 3 feet or forward 3 feet, the background stays the same size, but the foreground will change dramatically. So what you're doing is you're keeping one part of the equation constant, and you're able to work around with the foreground and place it where you want it to be. So I find primes are the way to go. Or if you can't afford to do it, I would say, well, what you do is you get a bit of sticky tape and you stick it on your lens at 24mm for the next 6 months, and you master wide angle, and then you put it at 50mm. And then you go out and you'll walk out again, you'll go, blimey, I can't work with 50mm, it's too in. But give yourself a couple of days or even a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden you're seeing 50mm compositions everywhere. And that's very much the case it's been for me for years. About a fair percentage of my website has been the equivalent of a 24mm with occasional 50mm, and with really occasionally a 75mm. Now that's just my style, but I do find that every time I buy a new system, I try and make sure I get the same focal lengths, because I think my eyes tuned into that, and I've become very, very comfortable with those focal lengths and know how to work with them. I think there's a tendency sometimes just to keep changing equipment, and then you're starting from scratch again with it. So I've got one last picture, Tim, so I think the timing's worked out pretty well. So I'm just going to show you this picture too. And I just stopped because I love the frost kind of aspect of the trees there, the super, super light. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not big on pre-visualization. I didn't quite know what I was going to do with it when I got home. But I'll just show you how dark the trees actually were when I was there. And I think that's part of it, is about knowing how far you can pull and push things when you come back. It actually looks much darker on the picture here than it really was. But it is a very different place. But I think it's about knowing the tonal variances and how far you can pull and push the scans. They're all Velvia. So the problem I've got is that if you do any sort of really drastic curve adjustments on it, you'll get like the substrate of the film coming through sometimes. Sometimes that's quite nice. The texture you get is great. And other times you're just trying anything to avoid it. But I'm certainly not a verbatim photographer. I'm very much this, I think the darkroom's a real creative place to be. So I'll just go back to that image. And again, I'm just trying to sort of distill it down. Simple tones. The sky is almost the same tone as the ground is. And I thought I'd finish up. I just think, with due respect, it's worth mentioning if anybody wants to know who the music was by. I find that music is very inspirational for me. And when I'm editing, I love to put on usually music. If I'm editing images from Iceland, I've got music from Iceland on there. And it just allows my brain to sort of just connect to this kind of dreamlike state. I think that when we're creating just anything, you don't necessarily have to be a photographer. You've sort of tapped into this kind of other world thing, and you're kind of lost in that. And I think it's almost like tantamount to meditation. I don't know if you guys find that, but every time I stop with a group somewhere, you can never stop for 1 hour. And if you say at the end of 1 hour, we're going back, they say, oh, we've only been here for 5 minutes. because we all get lost in it. I think it's fantastic. Anyway, that's the end of my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, Tim.
Big thank you to Bruce for finishing off the day for us here. And I think David's got a few words about what's happening next.
Just kind of boring housekeeping. Well, not necessarily boring housekeeping things. The bar opens at 7. And dinner is served from 7:30. So you have time if you want to go back to your hotels or whatever between now and then. And there is a seating plan by the registration desk out in the foyer there, so that you'll know where you're going to be. Please don't just sit at random. You might find somebody already there. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for joining us for today. It's been a really kind of brilliant selection of different kinds of photographic view, I think, and we will no doubt continue the discussions over dinner. Bye for now.
Thank you very much for giving us a fantastic talk. And I was particularly taken with some of the Hokkaido images, which I hadn't seen before. And,
All right.
we have a couple of questions from some of our people on Twitter, and the first from Jim Robertson on
Yes.
YouTube. Do you use the square format exclusively? So is it Hasselblad and no Mamiya?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Mamiyas. I've actually got 5 Mamiya 7s in a closet, and I keep buying them because they're a bit of a flimsy camera. They're not well made. But I do have a particular love for that camera, and I did a lot of my, say, the first 10 years with the Mamiya 7, and it's just, I'm not even consciously aware of it, but I actually looked at it recently. I went, hang on a minute. So it's almost the last 4 or 5 years it's been square, and I just seem to be, you've got to run with whatever you're feeling at the moment. But some people have made the assumption, they've said to me, so I guess the Mamiya 7's out the window, and I'm saying, well, I don't know. It might come back. It just might be, I might want to shake it up a bit more again. Maybe I'll find that squares is too simple. I don't know.
We've seen from John Blakemore that things go in cycles and returns.
Absolutely, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. And what I like about John is he's completely open to this idea of just going wherever he feels he wants to go. And that's quite a brave thing for a lot of people. They're sort of worried that maybe they're going to lose something in the process. I think he's actually happy with that. He's happy just to sort of discard things, maybe to find something new.
Yeah, I did get the impression that he was dividing into little strands, and he'll find one that will survive and carry on. And
yeah, definitely. I think that's it's really it's. I don't know if there's a confidence thing involved in that, but it's certainly about being true to yourself. And I liked very much the idea that he said that he doesn't really quite know where he's going with it, but he just has to run with that flow. And so the question about the square, I don't know. I just keep running with it until something else pops up.
Probably for people who are familiar with Mamiya 7s and Hasselblads, do you see a difference between using a waist level finder and a rangefinder style finder? Does the way of seeing the landscape change it for you as well?
Well, I'd need to think about that one. Let's see. Well, apart from the size of the viewfinder, the Mamiya 7, the viewfinders are actually quite tiny when you go back. And when I got the Hasselblad, I couldn't work with it for about 6 months. Every time I looked in it, I couldn't see the edge of the frame. And it is easier in the way that you can see where you're placing your grads and things. But I've said for a long time on the blog that what I liked about the Mamiya 7 was the approximation, that you don't quite know what you're getting. And I really love that about photography. I don't really want to know exactly what I'm getting. I want to be surprised.
And do you work on the viewfinder, or do you work and find the pretty much the picture before the camera comes out?
Oh, usually, sometimes I can actually just see it. It's over there, and I can actually draw. You know how some people use the cards for helping them find. I don't feel like I need them. I just kind of see it straight away, and I'm off to play with it. But I was talking to Mark Littlejohn about that earlier, and I was saying to him that I find that every time I pick up the camera, I have to be fully accepting that I might fail.
Yes.
You know, you've got to be open to that, because you've just got to explore it and see what happens. And as a workshop leader, you'll find that somebody say to you, you know, is it okay if I try this? And I say, you can try anything you want.
Playing's important.
Absolutely it is, yeah, definitely.
We got a question from Alan Ranger on YouTube as well. Do you have an explanation for the preference to more subtle images as you become more familiar with a location?
Well, I don't know if it's because I've become more familiar with the location that they become more subtle. I do think I've noticed that my tones are getting more muted now, and that I do seem to be looking for softer tones, but that just seems to be something that's happening irrespective of where I go. If I keep going back to the same places, Patagonia and Bolivia and Harris, I just find that they're all getting the same sort of treatment.
I noticed a lot of earthy tones coming in your photography over time as well that maybe weren't there before.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that's because I figured out I'm not very colour aware. I think I'm actually quite colourblind, and I'm more shape aware. And when I look back at the earlier stuff, I can see that a lot of it's just got this. Maybe the colours are too loud, or they're a bit one-dimensional, because they're all sort of like very twilight colours or something. So there's been a lot of in recent years. I've actually found that the colour balance layer in Photoshop has become very important to me.
Okay.
Velvia shadows can be quite blue.
Yes.
And when you're working in a monochromatic landscape like the black beaches of Iceland or the black beaches of Patagonia, you don't want a black beach to look blue.
No.
So you find that
you're happy to take the Velvia and you treat that as a raw file.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. It's a starting block for me. I'm never trying to replicate what I got in the negative. Occasionally you'll get a transparency, think everything I like about it is lovely, but the chances of getting it right in camera, I think, are pretty slim. And besides, it's not even about that. I've often felt that the post process is 50%. You know, the clicking the shutter is 50%. You're only halfway there, and this idea that that's the end of the story and that's truthful, that's a deception, that's a lie.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, this idea that we've been editing work right from the word go is what it is.
Many people had a reverence for transparency of film when they were happy to manipulate colour negative, black and white negative, but if you treat it the same, it shouldn't matter, should it? It's just a starting point. If it's a good starting point, that's great. But
that's the key point for me, because normally when I get my films home and I put them on the light table, usually your eye just goes straight to something and you go, oh, I love that. So you've got to feel inspired to work with it. It's not that you're looking at it thinking, well, maybe if I mess about with this, I can make it look decent. It's not about that. It's very much about you see something in it.
Ingredients.
It's an essence or something that you want to pull out. So it's about working with that, and you've got to feel inspired. So no, it's very much about the creative process, and I can get lost in there for days. I actually like to do the editing in a consecutive block. I hate doing like piecemeal images. One thing I didn't talk about in that talk was about John was very kindly putting collections together at the end of his talk, and I'm big on this, about this idea that, you know, tuning the images so that they belong as a whole.
Yes.
You know, so you'll edit on an individual basis, and then what you'll do is about a week later you'll come back and look at them and say, this one's slightly jarring because it doesn't fit in. It's either compositionally wrong or the tones are wrong, so you can fix the tones.
Yeah.
And you can pull it in line with everything else, and all of a sudden it's like it's just snapped into focus.
Yeah, I went on one of John Blakemore's bookmaking workshops, and the sequencing and the thought processing that tries to distill your imagery is actually really useful. Not necessarily for making a book, just for developing as a photographer. Absolutely.
I was talking to Miles Flint about that. He's one of my clients, and he told me he went on the trip with John to do the bookmaking thing. And I said to him, well, even if you don't even come out with a book at the end, it's just even helping you think about image selection, portfolio, style.
Yes.
Everything, it's all wrapped up in there. Everything's so interrelated in what we do, I think.
And we just touched on, before we came back here, simplification and oversimplification. There's obviously a line somewhere before you reach an empty page. How do you try and negotiate that boundary?
I guess it's if you don't feel inspired by it, you can get images that are really, really simple, but they don't do anything for you. And I guess if you know that it feels contrived in some way, then you just need to walk away from it. But that's a very subjective thing, because personally I find it hard to understand why not everybody would like what I do. But I'm making a joke about that, because that's the thing. If you do your thing, you believe in it. But not everybody's going to get what you do, or any style. And today we've seen a whole host of different types of work, and that's greatly encouraging in a lot of ways, because it obviously shows there's no right or wrong way about doing things.
Jim Robertson asked about music in photography, and you explored a little bit of that at the end, but I see a lot of parallels in the way people have tastes in music. And we all accept that one person may like U2 and not like jazz, or one's country, and that's an accepted thing. We don't argue and say, your music's rubbish, you should listen to my trash metal.
That's right, yeah, we don't.
But within photography, it becomes more of a right or wrong thing.
Yeah, it does. It's a weird thing, isn't it? And I don't know why that is, because I running trips as well, I'm very aware that I've got very, very strong opinions, and that's a good thing in some ways, but it can also be like a bit of a prison sentence in another way as well. So I think sometimes it's like you've got to try and loosen things up a bit. But with the music thing, I do see there's a massive relationship to me with it. It's a way of just tapping into your emotional side, and it's a way of just zoning out of. Most of the time I think that when we take photographs, we tap into this Zen Buddhist mode where we're not actually aware of the future or the past.
Yeah,
we're just there.
The zone, or flow, I think it's described in terms of psychology. Yeah,
we're just there, and music helps you do that too. And I think that most people, if you're into photography, you're not just into it because of the techie bytes and numbers. It's probably because of the emotional side of it, and I'm sure of it. And music's very emotional too, so I think they do relate. And of course, there's this high correlation between mathematicians and photographers, and mathematicians and music.
Yes.
I worked in an IT department, and you could almost half the team were in a band.
Yeah.
So that there's that sort of thing too.
There's a surprising connection between
absolutely.
I say IT scientist, photography, and I quite like that link there.
Yeah.
There's where I used to work in the university. They used to have artists coming in and working with engineers as creative projects.
That's brilliant.
People working on genetic engineering, and they would have a person trying to paint some of the inspiration that people were getting working on these projects. I thought that was a fantastic thing.
I think there's almost an assumption now that the two of them are kind of unrelated, and sometimes when you look back at some of I think it's like the Greeks and everything, they actually didn't see the separation.
No.
They thought they were kind of, I believe anyway, I'm not a historian,
and I think even up to Renaissance times, definitely, and probably up to pre-Victorian times it was there.
And somehow we've made this idea that like science is cold and clinical, and that creative things are just purely like intuitive. I'd love to think that creative stuff is just purely intuitive, but it isn't. I think and photography is an interesting one because it is a mixture of intuition and technical stuff too. So it's both if the left and right brain thing is really true, because I read something the BBC lately said that it's not. But
I'm unsure about that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk.
No problem, Tim. It's been great. I've really enjoyed coming.